In all adversity of fortune, the most wretched kind is to have once found happiness. Imagine that you were going to die in the near future, and not just die, but die extraordinarily painfully, all for the crime of sticking by your principles and being a just person who fought evil and corruption in your state. This was the fate awaiting the philosopher Boethius at the beginning of the 6th century. He was imprisoned on charges of treason merely for defending the Roman Senate, and as a result was brutally executed. While he was in prison, certain of his macabre fate, he wrote down all the thoughts and ideas that gave him comfort in his final days. This is the Consolation of Philosophy, and it contains some of the most insightful writings on how to endure an unlivable situation that I have ever read. Every page is packed with reasoned arguments and heavy pathos. If you are going through some severe suffering, then Boethius has something to offer you, and I hope you'll explore him with me today. Get ready to learn the value in some of our deepest philosophical problems, what kind of ideas make life worth living, and much, much more. As always, bear in mind that this is just my flawed and incomplete interpretation of Boethius's words, and I do encourage you to read him for yourself, as this will be infinitely more valuable than anything I can tell you. But with that caveat, let's get started. 1. The problem of pointless suffering. In theology, the problem of evil is the idea that an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving God would not allow for any evil to exist in the world, since he would know about it, be able to stop it, and be more than willing to stop it. Since evil exists, some people argue that a God with these 3 properties cannot exist. However, arguably, this is a variant of a much deeper and more emotional problem, which is simply the existence of suffering itself. In one of the oldest works of literature we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh, our protagonist is driven to existential despair by the death of a loved one and the fear of his own impending demise. Here, he is not worried about the promises of an all-loving and all-powerful God. The problem lies not in contradictory properties, but the bare, harsh reality of pain itself, and especially pain that seems pointless or unjustifiable. Boethius is confronting this problem in droves. He is writing the Consolation in prison, awaiting torture and his eventual fate, being beaten to death. And his distress is not just caused by the fact this terrible sentence awaits him, but also because it all seems so unjust. He spoke up in defense of the Senate and Rome for all he saw as right and good, and now he is condemned to die for it. He insinuates that the main reason his political enemies have orchestrated this downfall was because of Boethius's impeccable character and incorruptibility in his office. Boethius served as a minister, and he brought people to ruin for misusing their positions, and this made him a threat to anyone who planned on doing so in the future. In a world of factions, he chose to be principled, and for that, he must suffer and be snuffed out. The sheer bewildering unfairness of it all eats away at Boethius's heart. He is a virtuous man, helpless in the face of amoral superior powers. He wants to cry out, "It's not fair," and he is right, it isn't. The whole situation is supremely unjust. So what comfort could he possibly take from it? I think the way Boethius frames this problem as one of unfair suffering really cuts to the heart of why this book can resonate with us today. While we are hopefully not awaiting a painful execution, most of us are perpetually being beaten down by the everyday injustices and pains of life on this planet. We've tried to make a relationship work for years, only to later discover that our partner is just not ready to settle down. We have stood up to corruption in our workplace or organization, only to be fired for our troubles. We have defended someone unfairly maligned in the name of truth. But rather than stop the machine of condemnation, we were instead caught in its grasp. Boethius touches upon something we all know to be true, but is also one of the most agonizing parts of the human condition. Sometimes you can be honest, integrous, and principled and still end up losing. Sometimes you suffer completely unjustifiably. This same problem is reflected in the small child denied dessert for misbehavior they did not commit. 2 martyrs tortured to death for defending their values in the face of an authoritarian government. It is what Plato saw as one of the deepest ethical problems in philosophy. What use is the good, since it is constantly trampled underfoot by the evil? I tend to refer to this broadly as the problem of pointless suffering, and it arguably hits at the core of existential issues in philosophy. After all, if we only ever felt pleasant sensations, then there'd be no need for anything beyond enough food and water to sustain our bliss-filled lives. We would reside in a biblical-style Garden of Eden, desiring nothing and simply enjoying existence itself. This is still the state that some monks profess to fall into after years of study and meditation. However, since existence is flawed, we experience suffering. This would not be so bad if we only ever suffered in service to something we found meaningful. If, whenever we experienced pain, it brought about greater pleasure later down the line, or was for some grand value we held. But for most people, meaningful pain seems to be the exception rather than the rule. When I get injured or lose a loved one or fall ill, this is not some grand edifying experience in and of itself, but it instead seems remarkably hollow. Pain can seem indiscriminate and ridiculous and defy justification. It comes across as the uncaring face of the universe laughing at us, letting us know that all our effort and striving will come to naught. It is one of the most visceral times we lock eyes with what Albert Camus called the absurd. The gulf between the meaning we want to see in reality and the universe's silence in response to our plea. We are in agony, and for what? Precisely nothing. This in turn might be okay if all we ever faced was a stubbed toe. Normally we can get over such trivial pains pretty quickly. But I would wager that almost every single person watching this video has experienced profound pain that moreover seemed unfair or arbitrary. Nietzsche thought this was one reason why people needed a sense of meaning in their lives, because without it we have no reason to bear all of this unpleasantness, and we would quickly fall into despair. This is partly what he means by his famous phrase, "The man with a strong enough why can bear any how." Conversely, someone with no why will find all but the most pleasant how utterly unbearable, since they'd be weighed down by the sheer pointlessness of their difficulties. And Boethius is in desperate need of a why. But on his way there, he first takes the time to outline all of the ways someone can find meaning that is too fragile to hold water in difficult situations. And his analysis can tell us a lot about how to answer existential questions in our own lives. If you want to support the channel and help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to my email list, my channel, or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. The false idols. To touch upon Nietzsche again, in his brilliant book Twilight of the Idols, he examines a whole series of things people worship as cornerstones of their philosophy. These include various aspects of our ethical systems, the prospect of system building itself, and even the supposed impersonal pursuit of truth. He taps these idols with a hammer to see if they ring hollow, and finding that they do encourages us to dispense with them forthwith. In a way, much of Boethius's book is doing the same thing. He examines many of the goals and pursuits that we think will bring us meaning, and he dismisses them all with pointed criticisms. In each case, he finds that the idol is not fit for purpose, that it will not actually grant someone the strength to bear truly hard times, and in some cases, it will only increase our unhappiness. The first idol on the chopping block is monetary wealth. In some ways, Boethius is criticizing himself here, because in his position as minister to the emperor, he had some serious cash on his hands for quite a long time. But under the cold light of reason, he starts to see this material prosperity very differently. On the one hand, he notices that it does not actually grant us the power to bear much hardship, since very often wealth itself is at risk in difficult times. And if this is the cornerstone of your sense of meaning, you will be well and truly stuffed. Then not only will we have no material comforts, but we will lose our very reason to be. Just as we cannot rely on a friend that supports us one moment but is gone the next, Boethius says it is unwise to place wealth as the great meaning provider of our lives. Although it is undeniable that access to bare necessities like food and water are essential if you want to continue being alive, Boethius thinks that if we center our existence on accruing ever higher piles of gold, then we will waste our lives chasing a phantom. Firstly, he says that if we actually achieve our goals, it will paradoxically add to our stresses. The minute we indulge in luxuries and get our dream house is the minute we become obsessed with maintaining it. And as soon as we value wealth not as a means to other things, but as an end in itself, our needs will climb ever higher, ensuring misery in the long term. After all, you could always be richer. Again, this is a particularly potent criticism for Boethius, as he all but admits to having been quite attached to his prior wealth. The same goes for the fleeting emotion of hedonistic pleasure. Famously, the philosopher John Stuart Mill argued that happiness was the supreme good of humankind, because it is what we are all secretly aiming for. But Boethius disagrees. He draws a distinction between a stable philosophical kind of happiness and a moment-to-moment kind of happiness, and says that the latter is always temporary, and that without hardship we are never forced to build up the resilience of our characters so that we can bear the brunt of life when it comes. And it will inevitably come. No one is such a successful hedonist that suffering will never come for them. Pain knocks on everyone's door at the end, and according to Boethius, making this pain bearable is one of the chief tasks of a personal philosophy. Then, paradoxically, Boethius manages to extract some gratitude from his current misery, because he knows that this is his last chance to build his philosophy to its strongest possible position. Or, as he artfully put it, the most happy men are oversensitive. And he thinks this is because, by their very lack of suffering, they have not been granted the opportunity to sharpen their resolve and philosophy. This is one of the key ways through which Boethius finds his consolation during his imprisonment. He is turning his pain into a service to what he values most, philosophy itself. This is not some trite argument that pain is not that bad, actually. Instead, it is the very fact it is so deeply unpleasant that makes it useful for Boethius. He is extracting what he sees as the positives from a horrific fate, without denying that the fate is indeed horrific, and thus he seems to be drawing blood from a stone. So, flying in the face of many of our post-Enlightenment ideals, Boethius views the pursuit of happiness again as an empty idol, and so he commits it to the fire. And this makes perfect sense if what Boethius is looking for is strength specifically in times of suffering. The answer to pain cannot simply be happy, or else no one would ever suffer. This is just denying the problem, it's not solving it. The very thing Boethius needs is the ability to make his unhappiness meaningful, and happiness itself cannot be of help here. So working through each of the idols, Boethius discounts them one by one because of how temporary and fleeting they are, until eventually he discovers the root cause behind almost any unreliable value: fortune itself. That is, anything that relies on factors outside of our direct control. According to Boethius, if someone wants to make fortune the source of their strength or meaning, then it will probably abandon them just when they need it the most. If fortune was rather kindly blowing in our direction, then that is just when a stable idea of meaning is a luxury. But when fortune flies away, it becomes a necessity. So putting any fortune-based good on a pedestal is the very definition of setting ourselves up for failure. We ensure that our meaning will crumble to dust at the very moment it is most vital. This is one upside Boethius sees in his sorry state. Fortune has revealed herself to him as a fickle mistress, and so he knows both not to trust her himself, but can also pass down that wisdom to us. And in his criticisms of these false values, Boethius discovers something that is almost as vital now as it was in his prison cell. 3. The constraints of value. This is going to sound like a strange question, but what makes an effective or ineffective meaning of life? What is the kind of thing that allows us to bear the slings and arrows of existence's unpredictable ills without falling apart? Boethius has already identified what doesn't work, and many people would probably agree with him. If pressed, most people recognize that endless riches will not make us happy in the long run, even if we sometimes forget that on a day-to-day basis. Likewise, a lot of people view the pursuit of fame or mere hedonic pleasure as shallow in some way. It is tempting to see this as simple snobbery, but I suspect it is because people intuit that these things will not be effective supports in times of trouble, just like Boethius says. But then that raises the question: what will be? Boethius, sitting in prison awaiting his painful demise, has some thoughts. We have already seen some of his criteria for meaning. They must not rely on simple fortune, but his logic for rejecting fortune was more basic than that. Our pillars of meaning must be stable and able to remain fixed even when our life is in tatters around us. That is, it must be something that remains with us even when all of our circumstances have changed. Thus, Boethius deduces that we should ideally build meaning on ideas rather than anything material. On reflection, this makes a lot of sense. Famously, it's very difficult to kill an idea, and you can take it with you in pretty much every situation. This seems to be one reason Boethius thinks so highly of philosophy. It produces the kind of stable ideas that we can rely on even when shit hits the fan. This is also why Boethius turns specifically to reason to be his guide during his imprisonment. Reason is what stabilizes a justified and valuable idea. If you posit something without any argument or evidence, then you're likely to forget it or be persuaded away from it pretty quickly. But if our position is grounded in reason, then it becomes solid enough that we can rely on it to be with us as time marches forward. Hence why Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, said that while assent was like a loose grip, knowledge was like a closed and secured fist. And there are a number of beliefs and arguments that Boethius uses during his attempts to find firm philosophical foundations for his torment. The first of these is that the cause of a lot of excess suffering is desire, and that desire in turn is sparked from an inability to make sense of one's situation. Following thinkers like Epictetus, Boethius regards the impulses of the body as robbing him of his freedom. He expands upon the critique we've just looked at by saying if you desire riches, you may debase yourself to get them. And if most people simply followed their desires, they would become totally disorganized, since we often desire conflicting and contradictory things. This is a recipe for misery. In essence, Boethius is arguing that unhappiness is found in the discrepancy between how we desire the world to be and how the world actually is. This is a classic philosophical analysis, and it is found everywhere from early Buddhist thinkers to the idea of unrequited love. And it's worth noting that Boethius is not arguing this while dwelling in the lap of luxury, but locked in a prison cell awaiting torture and death. So unlike with a lot of thinkers, we cannot charge him with hypocrisy here. The rest of his Consolation essentially turns on this realization that in order to lessen his desire for things to be otherwise, he must come up with a way of making sense of his situation. Furthermore, he does not want this to stem through fooling himself, as that would be unstable for all the reasons we've just discussed. He wants to find meaning out of logical inquiry. And he does not think that this is going to be an easy task. In fact, he complains that the senselessness of his situation is truly unbearable. Would not his reason compel him to recognize it as such? But he concludes that, despite all appearances, his suffering is meaningful. And he does this in a series of very interesting ways. First, there is a psychological component to his approach. He questions what he would have had to have done in order to alter his fate. Reflecting on this, he realizes that it was abiding by his sense of right and wrong that led him here. It was his very refusal to let wrongs be committed in his eyeline without intervening that means he will now die. But what would be the alternative to this approach? Would he rather have betrayed himself? He considers the situation of the person who would throw in every moral they had for simple expediency and asks if they are truly happy. He concludes that they face an even more miserable existence than him. The implicit suggestion here is that Boethius could either have chosen to be tormented by others or to be tormented by his own mind. But if he betrayed himself, he wouldn't even have the comfort of his own goodness and integrity. He would view the sting of his conscience as even more painful than the executioner's cudgel. Furthermore, according to Boethius, the issue of how he would want the world to be is sort of idle anyway, since he endorses a loose form of rationality to the universe's movements that he considers to be far more important than himself. Consistent with many philosophers of his time, Boethius believes in a sort of divine order to events. The root of this belief is different in different thinkers, but essentially, whether they believed in an agential god or not, they saw that the universe was predictable based on certain rules. Rules we would now recognize as laws of mathematics or physics or logic. Then, to simplify, some thought that if reason meant anything, then it had to include these fundamental laws of the universe. And furthermore, many argued that what we would call logic or human rationality was justified based on its accordance with these naturalistic principles. This belief manifests in various forms, and it's found all over the place in ancient philosophy, from the Stoics to portions of Aristotle to early Christian thinkers, all of whom influenced Boethius greatly. So Boethius draws on this idea and says that if the universe is supremely rational, then there must be a reason he is suffering his fate, even if he does not know what it is. Again, we must bear in mind that this is not just a trite remark about everything happening for a reason, but it follows from Boethius's considered conception of how the universe works. He is not denying that the situation he is in is truly terrible, and that a grave injustice has been performed in sentencing him to die. But Boethius is drawing on some of the best philosophical and scientific theories of his time as a way of making sense and understanding his pain. He is not rejecting his suffering, but making it meaningful by taking comfort in the progression of universal reason. I don't want to evaluate this philosophical framework here. There are obvious criticisms you can make of it from a modern perspective, and if I go into them, then we'll be here all day. I just want to point out how this allows Boethius to come to terms with his desire for things to be otherwise, by sublimating them to something he sees as far more important. His philosophy allows him to tolerate what could have been a totally unbearable situation. His fate may be terrible or horrifying in a way that is difficult for us to even imagine, but he does not see it as pointless. Of course, it's difficult for us to use Boethius's exact framework because we don't tend to view the universe in quite the same way. But I want to analyze some of the insights Boethius turns to for comfort and consolation, and what it can tell us about our own existential challenges. 4. What makes a meaning? As I said at the beginning of the video, one of the reasons Boethius is still read and studied and enjoyed today is that he addresses an extreme form of a problem that we all encounter, the issue of how to deal with our own suffering. And even if we disagree with his particular answers, there is much we can learn from Boethius about the process he underwent in finding comfort in his torture. And these are fantastically relevant, whether we are processing a breakup, have fallen on hard times, or are just bewildered by the endless pockets of suffering that seem to stretch before us, running from now to the grave. The first lesson I want to highlight comes from the initial stages of the book, where the spirit of philosophy counsels Boethius to look inside himself for strength, rather than place his meaning in the hands of external circumstance. This makes a lot of sense for the reasons we've already examined. Boethius can always rely on himself to be there, whereas anything else is inherently unstable or temporary. This does not mean that there is nothing about the world that is worth changing. It just advises us to take our source of meaning from within rather than without. The second is that it is not enough to simply wish the pain away with pleasant words. At one point, Boethius says to the spirit of philosophy that her words are comforting in the moment, but he finds her insights very difficult to sustain over time. And this is perfectly understandable and probably familiar to many of us. While Boethius is convinced of his reasons to be in short bursts, he has not yet undergone the arduous process of internalizing these reasons, learning to lean on them for his comforts rather than in empty hopes or wishful dreams. The third is that parallel to the much celebrated pursuit of happiness, we need something that allows us to bear suffering without collapsing. Boethius is not the only person to point this out, but the fact he is staring torture and death in the face adds a certain urgency and plausibility to his analysis. This means that in our existential experiments and approaches to life, we have a vital criterion. How well does this hold up, not just when I am feeling good, but when I am feeling well and truly dreadful? Anyone can wax lyrical about the beauty of life when they are happily married, have a stable career, and two charming, chubby-cheeked cherubs. But would their meaning hold together if they were to lose everything and end up on the bottom of the pile? I think many of us certainly are guilty of focusing purely on the pursuit of pleasure, rather than the ability to bear the times where the pleasure runs out and the pain starts to come. If I were to reflect on my own life, I think my reasons for being could stand some stress. But if I were to truly lose everything, I'm not sure they would survive. And that shows I have more work to do. It also highlights the extreme difficulty of existentialism. It is by definition really bloody hard to find something that will help you bear unimaginable pain. But this does not make the issue any less important. In fact, it shows that if life is going all right at the moment, then this is the perfect opportunity to prepare ourselves for the hard times that inevitably lie ahead. To repurpose a thought from Machiavelli, temporary peace is not merely for relaxing, but for bolstering our defenses. In this case, our defenses against torment. Lastly, I want to focus on the fact Boethius turns to a metaphysical picture of how he views the universe in order to find comfort and meaning. A question that often chugs away in the background in existential debates is whether someone needs a genuine belief in something higher than themselves in order to have a robust reason to carry on. Some philosophers like Kierkegaard or Schopenhauer strongly suggest that we do, or at least most of us do. And in very different ways, they paint existentially affective philosophical views of reality in order to help people deal with the sufferings of life. On the other hand, someone like Nietzsche seemed highly skeptical of the idea that we needed our sense of meaning to be grounded in a view of the world itself, or something beyond the world. He was much more optimistic that if we just organized and strengthened our wills enough, we could create meaning out of that. Hence his idea that someone's ability to bear suffering is in direct proportion to the strength of their will. A similar thought, though very different in detail, is expressed by some French existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre. Absurdist thinkers like Albert Camus throw a completely different light on this question, because they view the need for a meaning to life as resting upon a belief that the universe owes us that meaning. I'm personally really torn on this question, and I suspect it might vary from person to person, and I would love to get your thoughts on it. Do you think we can have stable meaning that we necessarily view as maintained only by our own will? Or would the fact that we recognize our meaning as essentially subjective entail a certain fragility? Since we would be the only ones enforcing the meaning, and it's notoriously difficult to exert our will when we are in extreme suffering, would it fall apart at the first sign of trouble? If you think this depends on individual temperament, what are the sorts of properties you think someone would need to have in order to will meaning into existence? And how can we learn to achieve these properties? Whatever your answers to these, I think Boethius's work contains a treasure trove of insights into the kinds of jobs a personal philosophy can do, the sorts of constraints we might want to place on its construction, and, perhaps most importantly, how through philosophy someone was able to suffer an agonizing, painful death with a calm and serene mind. And whoever we are, we can certainly learn a lot from one of the bravest thinkers of all time. But of course, you're going to find the question of meaning very difficult if you're an outright nihilist, so click here to check out my analysis of this terrifying philosophy. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.